housekeeping for today. All right. Beautiful. Welcome. I think this is our first session in June, and really excited to have folks here today. It's been our first governance session, I think, in a few weeks, because we've had to go back and forth now. We've had a couple cancellations just due to timing, holidays, vacations, working group meetings. So we've had a couple topics on the agenda here that we've wanted to talk through for a while now, but just time hasn't worked out. We wanted to preserve the time that we have on our profiling calls on our every other Fridays. So happy to be here with you folks today. And as a reminder, I think if you've been catching up on any of our prior materials, we've gone through a URL facelift for our FHIR project. So if you haven't, or if your colleagues haven't, make sure you update the project URL here if you want to find our content very easily in the FHIR environments. That being said, I'm raising again because one of the topic items that I think we're wanting to probably action on pretty quickly here, we've been talking about it for a while, is our canonical. So when I talk about a URL facelift in FHIR, it's different than the canonical, but that will be a topic of discussion today. For other topics for today, I think there's one housekeeping one that we can knock off pretty quickly. And then I think we've got some really good discussion points around the CA Core review, like our relationship with CA Core. And I want to have this as a community put our thinking caps on for how we can take kind of our feelings that were expressed on the earlier April call and kind of put them into kind of practical action for, what are the points of engagement that I think that we can try to further along in the core span of things. And then I really want to get into the canonical URL discussion because it would be good for us to have a timeline and a plan in place for us to make the migration. So just kicking off today, hopefully one of the really quick items that we can cover is in our profiling stream, we have been going through the last two sessions, really focusing in on some of the more QA items in our issue log. Originally, we thought 2 sessions ago that we've got some invariant changes that were relatively straightforward. As we started to dig into them and review them on our last profiling call, we realized actually they're quite a bit more interesting because they're not just around changing the syntax, but it's actually around investigating whether or not the expectations that we have in place actually hold up to some of the other rules that we have in the profiles now. Because we've done quite a lot of work in terminology and must support and cardinality expectations. But I think one of the kind of sadly overlooked items that we have in place that are part of our cleanup now is the places where our invariants are a little bit too strong and they don't hold up against the reality that we have for the rest of the profiles. So that doesn't have to necessarily be where folks want to have the conversation next Friday, but I do want to raise it if there's folks who are interested in being a guest host for the June 14th. Mike and I are both out. So I'm just doing it like we can cancel it, but if there's anyone who wanted to join, talk about profiling, show cool tools that they're using, dig through items in the issue log, we don't want to have to cancel it just because you don't have Mike or I to open up the Zoom for you. We can get you sorted on that. Is there anyone that's interested in one, keeping the June 14th and starting up the Zoom and helping discussion through a grab bag of topics? We put the ask out on the forum and I didn't see anything so far.
I think the only thing I'm maybe interested in is getting a gauge of how people might feel about a extensions registry and have it be community driven the same kind of way we have for the baseline right now.
Awesome. So you're thinking like have a dedicated topic on the 14th?
Um, for
or talk about it today?
today, I
Okay.
think.
Yeah, I was gonna
Okay.
say, I think that's more of a governance issue than it to start with than it is the profile call.
Yeah, probably to start. But there definitely is probably some technical discussions folks might want to have around
Yeah.
how that might work. Ken, how much time do you think that you would want to allocate against it?
I think really just kind of just float the premise out there and one some of the reasons why we're considering it, and hear people's feedback from that as well. So maybe about 10 minutes.
Okay. I'm also going to put, so this would be like, there was another question I saw come through, I think on Zulip around additional bindings. So like if folks are interested in talking about additional bindings, maybe that could be another topic for the June 14th. Why don't we start? Do you want to, well, actually, how do folks feel? Do we want to start with the extension registry? We'll cap it at 10 minutes because these I think are going to be much longer conversations. And so I hate to like push this down the line if we think we definitely won't get to it today if we get discussions underway for these two items.
That sounds like a good idea, Sheridan.
Perfect. All right. Ken, do you want me to just, I can, capture like folks' thoughts or whatever we hear as we go along? I'll just add a slide.
That sounds great.
Perfect. All right. Floor is yours.
All right. So as we've kind of been working through things like the CA core, we started finding that, there's probably going to be some extensions that may be used based on some of the existing specs that are out there, but not really used consistently in every spec out there. So kind of the approach that we've been taking with core is that, it really should be kind of the intersection of kind of the elements and the data content that is similar or the same across multiple specs. And so things that are only useful in, maybe one or two contexts really don't belong in the core. And so that's what we're thinking, some of the extensions, a lot of times they're defined at the provincial/jurisdictional levels. But we may see that some of these make sense to kind of promote to the national level so that everyone's using the same canonicals for the extensions. For example, if Ontario and Alberta end up needing a similar concept, it doesn't make sense for one or the other to own it. It makes probably more sense for it to be raised up to the national level. And so we're wondering if it should have a home maybe in a kind of a national extensions registry with a national extensions registry canonical. That way it can be used, packaged by other specifications that require it and wouldn't be bound to some of the existing publication cycles of things like a CA core. And also, if jurisdictions want to kind of add their own extensions, even if they are locally defined to that registry, it helps surface, what other jurisdictions are using so that it's a lot easier to find than having to search through other existing specifications. And, when we start seeing, more than one jurisdiction using the same extension, then it starts making sense to say, hey, we should maybe consider this for promotion into the national level.
I have a question. I'm wearing my HL7 Canada hat firmly here, which is, it seems to me that it might be also useful for us as an affiliate or as HL7 Canada to potentially ballot extensions as well in terms of gaining consensus and insight from other people, and then maybe reducing the duplication of extensions if there seems to be a tendency to do that. This is very theoretical. I'm not sure it's really required or not, but I just wanted to ask the question, see what people thought about it.
Yeah, Ron, I actually think it's a good idea, just like International is balloting their extensions, but balloting them on a different cycle
Yes.
from the base. Of course,
Yes.
it does create some version problems sometimes in terms of if you're trying to ballot material, is the extension still in draft or is it been balloted, etc. So there's some dependencies to manage.
Yeah,
but I think it's worth diving into. One of my core questions here is just like we actually reviewed a bunch of extensions on provided that BC uses for the baseline just to see if there's anything in there that had broader applicability, and we decided there wasn't. But just like we have some challenges now around the URI registry and other things, who's gonna own the maintenance and management of it? Because I think we need to have really clear, where do you go to get something in? Where do you go to see if your extension should be promoted to national? Who makes those decisions? You know, the governance things about this are really important. I think just creating the registry has some utility, but it gradually devolves into entropy if we don't deal with the governance questions.
Well, I think these are excellent questions. I think we can, I think it's part of the terms of reference activity that we've got going, Sheridan. We might want to discuss this a little bit more in terms of the implications of it. You know, one of the things is that I am encouraging the idea that, one, if we ballot a thing, it increases awareness. Two, if we are saying, hey, people should reuse this, it has authority because it's been balloted and the community at large has said this is good. And then finally, what I do think will be happening, not unlike the way the HL7 work groups do it, but there does seem to need to be a home in terms of the sustainment of things, or at least from a governance perspective, making sure that if some adjustments need to be made to something post fact, you know, we have a mechanism to support them, whatever that means. And that might not mean it is a dedicated maintenance, you know, required capability, but that we have a mechanism to be able to pick that up to do something like that later. Anyway, that's a lot more than we probably need to talk about today, but you know, I think it's a good idea.
There's also the aspect of somebody's got to, how to say, make sure that we're not trying to create 3 different
Yeah,
extensions that all do the same thing.
I'm hoping that would come out in the you know, the initial balloting process, you know, intent to ballot, but also in the ballot itself, because we may not all detect this. Someone may detect it in terms of that process and say, oh, wait a minute, guys. What do we want to do about this? And this actually does happen occasionally in HL7 itself. So
Well, it happened with a bunch of voids from Alberta and a bunch of the other
yeah,
jurisdictions.
yeah.
So
Yeah, and we've still got challenges in the OID stuff, which frankly, that our processes about fixing that is somewhat broken right now.
Yeah. So this is where I think
So,
HL7 Canada is a useful construct in terms of being part of the governance envelope, in terms of validating at a national level for things that are done, you know, locally or done by whomever, but it does help that a great deal.
Can I ask, like, what parts of this? So, I'm just thinking through this practically. So we know that the CAURI registry, the idea of this is a content that is solely kind of like, it is owned by the submitter and it has some degree of change, but it's very uncommon, right? Is that?
well, frankly, when we tried to make changes in it, we've not been able to get those affected. So saying some degree of change, I think, doesn't really match the reality, because where we do need to change it, it's not getting changed.
Okay, so I guess what I'm guessing, so are URIs, like, once they've been published to the registry, like, naturally inclined to change? Or is it just additive? Because the reason I'm asking is I'm trying to figure out, like, is there a parallel between how you have to manage things that change frequently versus things that, like, we have extensions in the baseline that haven't changed in 4 years, that
Yeah.
haven't had any modifications on them.
I think some of the changes that are in queue that haven't happened are things that are dealing with sometimes just frankly cut and paste errors or typographical errors, or the fact that sometimes what will happen if we create things in Alberta and create things in BC and don't coordinate, sometimes then we have to work out the fallout of how to make that consistent if we bring it up nationally. And I've seen that in the OID registries before, when we've tried to fix some things in OIDs that are a little bit broken but are in use. So we had a few years ago, we had a big discussion around OIDs with Quebec and the other provinces about how to fix some things that are not clear, and what to deprecate and what not to deprecate, and how we were going to manage it. So I think it's those kinds of clashes that come up in terms of maintenance. And in the baseline, they're baseline extensions. We're not trying to coordinate them yet with extensions from other sources. And I think that's where the maintenance comes in, is when you're trying to manage multiple sources.
Are URI's version the way that extensions can be? Like, because we talk about like, oh, well, if something were to change in the baseline in 1.1.8 or 1.2, and you had like an anchor to, I care about the extension at this point in time, it's a protective measure, right? Is the same true for like the way that we consume URIs?
I think URIs, like OIDs, are treated a little different because really the only kind of updates you do to them is like clarifying a definition or a typo. You wouldn't want to really change it like you do with an extension.
Yeah. You
And
might,
so,
yeah, you might add a new one and deprecate the old one to do a fix,
Yeah.
but yeah, but not a
you
change.
rarely update anything other than slightly clarifying definitions. Whereas with an
Yeah.
extension, you could do all kinds of changes to it, and you
Mhm.
need versioning.
Yeah.
So like the possibility of like the depth of change is higher with an extension.
I think that's what Randy said, and I would agree with him. I think that was Randy.
Oops.
Yeah, basically.
And you brought up a very interesting topic today.
Yeah, I mean, I think it just came out of a practical issue that we were dealing with here, particularly with some of the extensions that are being used by Alberta that are coming out of the prescribe it specification, and kind of figure out, how do we kind of float those out for broader use rather than having it stuck in the existing IG.
When there are changes, or perhaps like jurisdictional extensions, I'm wondering, is there an opportunity for us to challenge those in a constructive way to say, is this really needed? I think it's that sort of that fine line between continuing to support current state, when current state is always has historically been defined by what was needed in the past, and not necessarily what's needed based on like a future state approach. I'm not explaining myself well. I'm trying to think of an analogy, but I'm running dry here today. And sometimes when we're introducing standards, those standards are designed to support a current state moving forward based on how things have always been done. And so if there is, for example, a specific extension that is being requested in a certain jurisdiction, that could be a legitimate request or addition or modification. However, there could be scenarios where we could mitigate that by challenging those constructively to say, is this actually perpetuating something that was defined in the past, or do we have an opportunity to do it a slightly different way such that this piece of the extension isn't actually needed? Did that make remotely any sense? I'm so sorry.
And some things may mean that we want to promote changes into the non-extension space based on.
When does an extension become more than not just an extension, but part of the baseline or part of core?
Well, I see a lot of them that are, yes, they are in some ways there to support the way we did things in the past, but sometimes that means that they're necessary to keep our existing systems running.
Right.
And so having them in the extension space rather than the core makes a lot of sense if that's what they're there for. And then other kinds, I think the example that comes to my mind is BC has an extension on practitioner that, for instance, captures if there's conditions on someone's license, right? So if for some reason there was, a disciplinary action that restricted someone's license or some other reason why the license is restricted, that's in an extension because it isn't anywhere in the core. But it's an important part of the business. So it may be that we have those kinds of things in extensions to start with until we see whether they're more broadly applicable. But in the case of the BC provider registry, that's one thing that business-wise they definitely want to track is, those restrictions on people's licenses, not just the license itself, as an example. I'm sure there's lots of examples in our extensions that are things like that.
I would agree. That's going to be necessary. It's always going to be necessary. But I think from a governance perspective, this is just a really wise approach, and it also allows us to mature our environment over time. I think I've got something I'll bring up. I won't bring it up today, but I have some other thoughts in terms of how we manage what is actually out there. But maybe I'll bring that up on one of the technical group calls just to see how people feel about it.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess one of the next steps will be to establish some of the criteria for what's in the National Registry, whether we use the registry to maintain jurisdictional items, and what's the criteria for those jurisdictional items to become national. So some of the just general guidance about how we do management would be something to be worked out.
So I've got this kind of follow-up question here. And I think it's important, right? So like a lot of these details, Ken, I think posed this as kind of like, hey, would this be helpful without, necessarily saying, oh, there's explicit boundaries for this conversation. Obviously there's a bunch of different ways that we've talked about, like extensions and the challenges that we've had in the baseline, pointing to other people's content ad nauseum for years, right? I think one thing I would push us to think about is like, is there a risk to doing this with things that like, maybe like there are things that we've already known and we can see in the baseline and we're seeing show up in core that like, they're already nationally oriented, like they aren't likely to fall into some of these like consideration areas, right? They're not necessarily regional. Is there a risk to doing like a subset of this, even if we don't have everything hashed out for like, are we even going to consider regional or jurisdictional or how do you request? And is there a risk to not doing this?
I think there's a good argument for starting with that smaller scope. And I think there is a risk to not doing it, is that we get things spread all over the place in different artifacts. One of the things we might consider is, like, if you look at the guidance from HL7 International on value sets, when they need to be promoted into THO and when they can stay in an individual implementation guide, something parallel is probably good guidance, because some things may be just truly part of a given implementation guide and they're not applicable outside of that context. And those don't need to be in the registry, right? I think the things that need to be in the registry are things we're going to try to share amongst our amongst contexts. But starting with the stuff that we know is shareable might be a good start.
But not necessarily, because I mean, unless you know something that absolutely is not going to be used anywhere else, there's merit in sharing the information there, because there's somebody else that you're unaware of is looking to solve the same thing.
Yeah, there is benefit to that.
So,
but I think it's a next step down the road in terms
Yeah,
of
I
how
think it's not to say like, oh, these are the boundaries and this is the only thing that could ever happen, but like,
Oh, I think we just start, and by having something happening, we will learn very quickly. Oh,
Yeah.
that's not useful, or oh, this is really useful, right? So I think we just would begin, and we'll evolve from there. But it does come to this other concept, which is I think there, particularly where FHIR is concerned, maybe more so than V3, there is a maturing process that will continue to happen as we iterate through releases of FHIR. And also, I'll be bold when I say this, I am anticipating that there will be future needs that we haven't identified yet, or that we have we have a sense of, that will maybe expand, resource definitions, things like that. Right now, it's not on the radar at all. We're all just trying to, get things done. But anyway, it's really about the concept of maturation of our interoperability at a national and regional and provincial level.
The other big difference between V3 and FHIR is how many people are looking to use FHIR versus how many used V3.
Yeah, exactly. And the burden of a threshold to actually get good at doing it. So, yeah.
And relative to like the localized extension models, and where there could be legitimate ones, or even where it's been surfaced jurisdictionally, but it becomes a regional or nationally applicable, and tying it back to yesterday's conversations around the new legislation for info blocking. Do you all feel like we would need to take a position or provide some clarification in terms of realistic timeline support that, so that it's not being perceived as info blocking? We don't end up with proprietary development, because we need it to be accessible to all. I guess I'm just trying to think of like making sure that wherever there are variations, that there is a controlled and inclusive way of making sure that it is usable wherever it could be useful.
Yep. Sounds good.
Harmonization, love it.
Yes.
Ken, did this kind of, I know it started the conversation, were there other things that you were hoping to have examined? Do you have kind of some of the perspectives you were hoping for?
Not particularly. I think, I'm definitely gonna keep looking at what's happening in other countries like US versus Australia and how they're handling extensions. So I'll provide, some feedback into back to this group. Wondering if this could be a kind of a standing item in our future governance calls, just to make sure we don't lose momentum.
Yeah, I like that.
All right, I will add it. Just to, discussing findings, updates, points around, or considerations and ideas. Okay, I will bold this for the action. Beautiful. All right, Ken, you said it first, which means probably at our next governance call 2 weeks from now, we'll just touch base to see if the thoughts, evolved at all, if you found anything regarding considerations from other countries, that kind of thing.
Sure.
All right. Okay. So the next point on the agenda is around our CA core. It's a chapter of the discussions that we've had around kind of our relationship to CA core as a community, as a technical set of artifacts, as an input point for the harmonization around requirements that we have in the baseline. A number of weeks ago, I was out at the end of April, and Mike was chairing a call, and he said, listen, there was great discussion about, one of the questions that we'd posed earlier coming out of the initial kind of review of the V0.1 content. And that folks felt was super worthwhile. It was a great way of getting exposure. It was a way of kind of parsing out the things that, were meaning to for review on kind of this weekly cadence, but that we needed to consider kind of how this might work in the future, right? Or if we would incorporate processes maybe looking at the change log, or doing components of how we interacted with reviews that reviewed previously that would allow for us to ensure that we keep making progress on the baseline, but continue staying up to date, reviewing, providing feedback on the core. And I know one of the things Mike had flagged was, that the folks still felt unclear around the reconciliation process, right? What does it look like moving forward? Is it what we're seeing with, are we trying to say we're moving towards being able to to disposition this as a community, and what are the impacts of that versus the reconciliation process that we went to before, which was kind of sharing, these are the feedback that we received from the community. Here are the places where, like, you know, there's an immediate place, technical correction makes sense versus it needs to be kind of escalated to upstream artifacts. One of the things that I wanted to pose, and I know I've mentioned it before, but I think, you know, if the CA baseline community wants to be more involved in, you know, engaging with the content and like interacting and providing feedback and having a say in the content, I think the challenge that we all share is figuring out like what that actually looks like with the fact that there's a ton of upstream artifacts, right? And in thinking about this problem, I was chatting with Mike. I'm like, I don't know if there's an answer. I know this is probably a space that other types of specs, particularly like cross-org specs, have had to figure out with their communities. But I wanted to bring it to this community because, like, you know, I don't want it to just be, well, it was helpful, but, you know, we still feel like not great about our interaction points, because if there's a way for us to improve, I want us as a community to come forward with and here's our idea for how that could happen. And like practical suggestions, because I don't know the answer to it. And so for folks that are on the call, like I know, you know, a number of us are kind of engaged in a bunch of different spaces. Like, have we seen how folks deal with this kind of upstream problem when maybe you're working on a spec that has both content from HL7 and IHE, in terms of, you know, the line that the HL7 working group has to walk versus the IHE working group? Or am I being too sensitive to, you know?
No, you're not. I was just thinking and waiting for others' thoughts. One of my questions is, now that things like CA Core and CAFEX are part of the building blocks working group, how do we work out our interactions with them and that process? And how do the two groups, which may end up with almost the same people on them, collaborate or intertwine or disambiguate who does what, you know? And I'm just not sure where all that's going right now. I'm glad to see it happening. It's early days.
I'm not sure if the C core has changed some fundamental content or not. It still stay on the Kai-High data framework that is still existing. Sorry?
I don't think it's changed its content. What's changed is that we've said that it's now, the sessions are going to be public and open and accessible because they're going to be part of the building blocks work stream.
Well, that's what I want to emphasize, because the context or content, as you mentioned, still based on the Kai-High data framework. I cannot remember
It
the
is, yeah.
specific.
Yep, it's very much like that's what's driving, like when we say upstream artifact.
Yep.
Yeah.
And actually, in that manner, my phrase may not that clear. I would like to let the C core flying in the air by itself for a while until the Kai-High folks or that joint team really could provide some concrete materials, specific some minimum data set. Then we can talk about the next step of the C core.
Although Kai-High is supposed to be more than a minimum data set, unlike USCDI. The Kai-High data framework is supposed to be not, by definition, not just a minimum data set. I think I realize that we need to see how things develop. I'm also always conscious of the fact that the world is moving fast around us. And if we're not careful, things and don't sort out some of the basics, the jurisdictional the jurisdictional and, you know, use case driven specifications and implementations will have had, you know, made the decisions and gone ahead and not have any justification to come back and harmonize. So, you know, I don't want to close the barn door after the horse is out. So there's a bit of a tension between those two very necessary things. We do need to see how it develops, but we can't wait too long because the world is moving fast around us.
And just bringing it back, I think I'm going to give an example to that, right? Because I agree. Like I don't think we can pause, and we know that the framework is, you know, continuing to evolve. It's continuing to produce, and so I don't think that the challenges that I'm seeing is around like those pieces being out of sync. I think the scenario that Thomas, that you described, in my mind, the worst case scenario that could happen if the baseline said, you know what, we want to start saying, we think you should change this, and we don't agree with this, and you know, we're suggesting changes be made in this way and voting on changes to be made in that way. The worst case scenario could be, you know, we're a bunch of folks that are in the modeling and the FHIR and the implementation space. But if we say, let's say, condition verification status, it's something that has come up in our community, is something that was desirable in the past. We say that's super important, more important than anything else. We want to, as a baseline, we're saying, core, make sure you add that in. And in an upstream artifact, a clinician's kind of reviewing this, and they're saying, you know, clinical status is super important, so is code, so are all of these things. Verification status, yes, it's important, but it's not in the same kind of level of need or degree. Then you basically have a subset of the community that says this is what should be in it, and you have another subset of the community that says this is what should be in it. And I think that is a recipe for challenge if it's not thought through well, and if we don't come to this with a kind of a real practical solution. And the solution to this point in time has been allow for the dispositioning to occur internally, so that there's a lot of back and forth that can be run between, okay, is this how conversations are going? You know, like, how do we consider verification status? Can we promote this feedback that's occurring? But if those are fully happening as separate channels and decisions are being made independently, I think that could potentially be a really big challenge for us. And it would be, I would think, as a baseline member, like a frustrating experience as a baseline member to find 6 months later that like the opinions that we had actually didn't shape up against what the clinical community felt. Am I catastrophizing there? Like, do we see that as like a real problem?
I think there's issues there. And one of the things that stood out to me recently is a discussion we've had with the Kai-Hi team on their, was it Iris application? That the guys working on that aren't even aware of CA core, baseline, or anything of this work. Yet they've got this running. And I'm just wondering, you know, we've got these big national level programs running with Kai-Hi stuff, with Prescribe It, and that it looks kind of strange from a side view, sitting there saying we have the CA core work going on, the CA baseline work going on, and these other two things national not even considering it. Although I'm not sure how far Prescribe It goes in, but these are things I think are going to send messages to people sitting there that how important is the core if our major application's not even using it.
So I actually think that's it's a interesting insight that I actually think aligns to a model that was recently put forward on like HL7 working group that basically talked about the fact that like we all kind of have our own little stakeholder communities, and that like the things that an application developer and an implementer who cares about information models, and the things that a clinician that cares about concepts and use cases and the things that a standards person, like in FHIR, cares about are actually different things. And so like, you know, if you're working in FHIR, that's one thing. But I think that this is a natural expression of how our systems work. Like, I don't know what's happening in a lot of like the surrounding implementation, kind of separate standards outside of the world of FHIR. I don't think that that's a bad thing as long as they're in sync.
Just come back to the FHIR principle or HR7 principle. Actually, is for data exchange. That's where we were standing on. We're talking about beyond that standard. From this diagram, you can see there's dramatic other standards working in a coupling way, loose coupling way with standard in a more integration manner to build a system to, you know, to help the business to implement the business models here in that manner. So in that, with this principle, we understand a FHIR standard role in this universe of standards. So we can start to think about our strategy, how to handle it, no matter how to see in the past HR7 Canada call. It's very good news and see to hear that the joint venture or collaboration between the open EHR with the FHIR standard community. And back to this question about the CA core, I would say this is very, very just one piece of title paper on the table so far. And just I cannot see any possibility to go through the different stakeholder, just like, for example, using the PCA that business model to see that go through interaction between go through different jurisdiction with, and then to see the improvement or maturization of those different profiles, IG, move forward. And CA core for me so far is still start to see the word very halo and not too much meat. And my understanding from ROI perspective, that might not have such value or worth to go forward that matter. And sorry it takes so long time. Come back to baseline work, and if I still can recall the short chat with Attila when he has a visit to Alberta, I questioned how this baseline work being initiated. He said, okay, he is one person to start to work on this baseline. That's what I recalled. He said, okay, we just want to find the environment to go to the trial and error way. So to engage the users, stakeholders to understand the FHIR. And eventually my understanding the FHIR is this exchange data standard need based on the data as input data source, which is a data model. Sorry, it takes so long time. Stop here.
Right.
So I realize that we don't have an answer to this piece right now. And so what I want to leave this with, I want to kind of continue to come back to this, which is to say that like, if what we're saying is our feedback from the baseline is we want to be more involved in reconciliation decisions, then I think we have to think through practically what that means. We have to come to the table with and this is how it could potentially work in the system that we are. Yeah. And if we don't have the answer, that's okay. We don't have to have it right now. But I think we have to just balance this idea of like, it can still be meaningful to engage, even if we don't, like, if we don't have the answer and can't do that decisioning yet, that there are a lot of meaningful points of engagement while we put our heads together and figure out how this might work.
I'll just say this. I mean, I'm old in the tooth now, but in a lot of my engagements with project teams, one of the things that was very, very beneficial is if you imagined a thing and it seemed plausible and potentially useful, you put it on the table, and hopefully you have enough memory amongst the group that at some point someone may stumble across exactly the problem that you were talking about discussing and say, wait a minute, no, I think we have an idea or an insight into what to do about this. We didn't need it at the time, but we imagined that it might be, and here we are. Okay, so let's go back and take a look at that, and this is what we do. And that has happened actually more times than not, and especially I find when if other people are in a hurry, or they're just that you sometimes a good idea gets brushed off because people have momentum and they just want to get to where they're going, right? So it's not uncommon that after the fact they realize, oh yeah, shoot, I missed that. That actually would have been helpful, and or, oh yeah, no, it's okay, we're good, because I think there is an alternative to what's just happened if we find there's a problem with it. So I really do value the idea of surfacing things. You don't want to waste a lot of time on them in terms of debating if you don't think the use is imminent. But if it seems to make common sense to people, yeah, I think it's definitely worthwhile doing. And I think we discover a lot. In terms of CA core and baseline, the thing I'll keep emphasizing is baseline is intended to be use case neutral. It's really at a conceptual level, but it is really truly trying to define concepts in as universal a way in the Canadian context as we possibly can. And then when you go into your core, you're doing actual use cases, and because you're narrowing down or you're focusing on a particular thing, to presume then that what is in core is actually sufficient for all future purposes is wrong. That's not a good assumption. And this is the benefit of having baseline and having those upstream things in our consciousness. I'll get off my soapbox now.
I'll add a quick update, and Thomas, I definitely agree with your sentiment earlier about, like what's kind of the purpose of framework and core, and when framework is still still being developed. We have a few releases coming up, and then figure out exactly how core represents that. So kind of the update is we're going to start we kind of pivoted the approach for core so that it reflects a lot of what we're seeing happening in the US and in Australia with their US CDI and US core, where the CDI are the data elements from a technology independent perspective of, here are all the elements that we want to be able to extract from the system just to promote interoperability. And then the US core is how you would do that using FHIR profiles. Same kind of way. There's going to be, the framework, which is kind of the universe of all of the health concepts and semantically what they mean, and the bound value set, so that, when we talk about, medication effective date in one region, it means the exact same thing in other regions. But then from that, we'll extract a subset called CA-CDI, which is kind of the data elements for interoperability. So things that are shared across a variety of use cases, so that if you've demonstrated that your system can produce all the CDI/CA core elements, then you're like 70-80% of the way towards any of the kind of the given use cases that are out there.
Thank you. I just want to borrow Ron his words and try to reflect. I go back on my understanding, maybe I'm wrong. But my understanding here, may we still put on the C core in our mind, and if you have some time, maybe spend some time work on it in the house. And at the same time, collect experience knowledge, go to other different projects. Like right now we have PCA, we have e-referral. Down the road, we may have, as Ken you mentioned, there might be more and more, FHIR relevant project on board. Eventually, once the business case or business demand on board, just like a sailing ship, right? We working to fix everything, do the, our housework. Eventually, winds comes up, and we will find opportunity to bring the CA core into the business discussion. Just stop here. Thank you.
So I think the biggest thing is that I still feel as confident as I did at the beginning of the year that the things that this community has been saying it wants for 4+ years now are in the works. They're happening. you know, we have now major updates that are going to help us reinforce them happening. And I would just, like, my ask is that, like, as a community, when we think about, you know, how we're interacting with the artifacts, to say that, like, to give some grace in this space while we're kind of figuring it out, and figuring out what it looks like to have, you know, inputs from the community in FHIR profiles when there are upstream inputs as well. And that, like, you know, think through what some of our practical suggestions might be if this is a piece of feedback that we want to provide as the baseline. But it is far from, I think, the only challenge that we have in front of us. And to that point, like, we have, from a baseline perspective, like, significant changes of our own, right? We've got pretty soon here, we're going to have to actually make the change to move to our new canonical. And that we have to make sure our own house is clean, you know, and from a baseline perspective before we start, you know, exerting some of our efforts, to, you know, try to think through the processes of others. So I wanted to raise this last item, and I was really hoping we had a little bit more than 5 minutes. But we've got to start talking about this, because I think it's been, Ron, like 1.5 years for canonical changes?
Yeah,
Maybe
yeah.
longer?
yeah, oh, yeah, yeah.
And so right now, like, from an HL7 candidate perspective, we had a discussion. We said we come back about what the domain was going to be, because we had HL7candidate.ca.
Yeah.
We've resolved one of the blockers, which is ensure that our domain that we would get through HL7 Canada is available, it's correct, something that we can anchor our canonical against.
Right.
I think for other blockers, the majority of them are, like, now communications based and timeline based.
Mhm.
So I want to bring it to the group to say, like, can we start changing it, right? Like, do we have to wait for something else to happen before we start making the port, so that our profiling stream can start working through the process?
I mean, this group and the implementers group are really key to our socializing this, making it clear that really we need to move. You know, we can't keep, you know, with the status quo too long. But here are the implications. What would your concerns be? We've already had lots of conversations around that, I think, frankly, Sheridan. So after that, it's mostly picking a moment in time with some advance notice, and then providing the communications and anything that people need to be able to do that successfully. And we just need to figure out what that lead time needs to look like.
Well, and we can make an assertion ahead of getting the changes implemented about what it will be, and some examples of, you know, what the canonical URLs will change to, so that people can start planning their own software changes.
Like, just a statement on Info Central to say,
Yeah.
we are going to replace this with this. Roughly, we're trying to accomplish this in the next 2 to 3 months. Start planning for this, and maybe here's what you do if you need time and want to anchor around your current version for a little bit longer.
Yeah, so that, for instance, we're planning to release another version of the specs of the IGs over the summer. So knowing where it's going,
yes,
can
Yep.
mean that we could start to prepare.
Right.
I did mention that it was coming on the implementers quarterly call earlier this week, and it didn't seem like very many people in that call were really aware that this was an issue. So we may have to do a bit more communication.
I think that's necessary. I also like the idea of a countdown clock, and not literally necessarily, but we remind them on, like, 3 times, and now at this moment this is going to happen, and we're this much closer to that moment happening. Okay, it's imminent. You know, just poking people. And again, people can choose, okay, I've got my own reasons why I may have to defer based upon product choices, you know, or what they're doing in their product planning. But at the same time, we have to, you know, if we really strongly as a community say, yeah, we bought into the idea and this is what we're doing, and giving them some time to make the adjustment, I think we should proceed.
Do
I'm
we
not
think-
sure.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not sure because from Randy might have more authority to talk about experience, but from OID perspective, normally we give them at least 6 months and maybe up to 12 months to allow the users to switch from original ID to the reassigned new ID. And I'm not sure there's also that how to see protocol can apply to this canonical URL. How to see a shift or movement.
I'm gonna guess that OIDs there's probably a significantly larger impact to them changing than a canonical in the context of a base. Because most people, if they're physically implementing it, are using packages and they're potentially maybe reprofiling from it, but I think we've been telling folks to pause on that for a while now. Is my read on that, like, I don't know, 6 to 12 months seems extensive for the degree of impact we would actually expect to occur.
I think if we say that, as of, version 2 of baseline or whatever version it will be, it's going to use a new canonical, that doesn't prevent people who are currently using it from using the existing published packages like the 117 or 18 that's out there right now. So it's more that if you're looking to implement baseline in some form or fashion, and you also want to kind of introduce additional changes, those new changes won't be coming to one of the existing published packages. It's only going to come to the new one.
Yes, and we said we wanted to get this fixed in the baseline before we balloted as well. So, but there can still be a baseline 2.0 with this fixed, as was pointed out, alongside the versions we're currently using, and people can make the call based on their own implementation schedules when they switch.
Yeah, and the reason I'm thinking about 2.0 is because semantic, like if we go by semantic versioning, changing the URIs are going to break everything that exists right now.
And so if we were orienting like around a baseline 2.0, I'm gonna guess that we're gonna want to do our QA at the same time, because right now we just discovered with our invariants there's a breaking problem with our allergy and tolerance profile. So I would anticipate that we would want to at least nail down the breaking problem instead of waiting to do like a 2.1 for that. Is that fair?
That makes a lot of sense to me.
So it doesn't have to be perfect, but should be like the major error kind of things.
I'm wondering if we should have like one final release that fixes all the breaking issues, and then an official 2.1 that just updates the canonical based on that final release.
What do folks think? Seem reasonable?
I think my gut feeling is that that's a very reasonable idea.
All
You know,
right.
That gives us the ability to poke around a bit in terms of addressing the breaking change problem without also, conflating it with the change in the URL. And once we
Yep.
get that done, okay, then we're good. Yeah.
My gut instinct is when we change the URL, that's when we should go to version 2.
So
Just
like
to make it
1.2 for this one.
Yeah, I like that idea, actually.
Yeah, I think that's a really good idea.
Okay.
Because changing a URL is a breaking change, so it makes sense for it to be in a major release.
So I think that that basically leaves us just with a stance that maybe we take to the profiling call of you know, how frequently, how soon do we think we can get these pieces out so that we can get this piece in play? And I never got confirmation, or like, is there anyone that is at least okay to open up the call, that wants to raise their hand, and I will send you the Zoom call for our next FHIR profiling call, so you can have discussions should you want them. You'll have a Zoom room for it. If not, we'll cancel it. Okay, so maybe we'll cancel it and resume in 2 weeks then. Okay, thanks for staying over. Thanks, folks. I'm glad we got the last bit taken care of, because I think that we're really wanting to turn a new leaf. Turn a new canonical leaf.
Hello.
All right, thanks, folks. Chat soon.
Thanks, Sharon. Great meeting.
Bye.
Yeah, Misha,